Right, good afternoon and welcome everybody to day 2 of the In-Between Summit. IBT, of course, being our sort of Bristolian version of the Venice Biennale. Just as watery and just as beautiful a setting, obviously. The title of our talk today then is Until the Women Are Free, the People Are Not Free. And that, of course, is from the famous poster by the C-Red Women's Workshop from back in the days of the second wave women's liberation movement here in the UK. The poster actually features in the Arnolfini exhibition in the gallery space, so you can see that out there. So my name's Finn Mackay. I'm going to be chairing this panel today. I'm a senior lecturer in sociology at the best university in Bristol, which is, of course, the University of the West of England. I do hear that there's another one, but I can never remember its name. And I'm also a trustee of the Feminist Archive South, and we have some of our materials in the Arnolfini Still I Rise exhibition as well. So lots of connections there. So we've got 6 artists, performers, makers, writers who are going to be talking briefly to you today. I'm going to introduce them all just before their talk, so you have it fresh in your mind when they speak, and then we've got plenty of time at the end for questions and discussion. So, I'll just give everyone a minute to get in, and I should also say, talking about that although this is of course a bit of a weird kind of tiered amphitheatre space, please do feel free to come and go as you like. We're going to be here until about 5 o'clock, so if you need to go out to use the toilet, get some air, get a drink, please just go and feel free to come back in again. There will be stewards at the door to safely guide people out and back in again. There are toilets on the ground floor. There are accessible toilets just by the entrance to the cafe. There are fire exits here where I do my air stewardess bit. There are fire exits on both sides of the theatre should we need them, but there is no alarm planned for today. So hopefully we will only be alarmed and excited by what we hear from our artists today. So without further ado then, I'll start with Liz Clarke next to me. Liz is a performance artist, maker and writer. She runs her own company. She has recently been writing about mothering and maternal practice, which has been widely published, working on a collection of short fiction. And her latest project is fusing feminist cyborg theories and cabaret. So I'm sort of thinking interesting sounding work there. Everyone's going to speak for about 5 minutes, so I shall hand over to you. Welcome.
Thanks, Finn. Hi, everyone. So I'm just going to read a piece of writing that I wrote after some musings on a journey home. And so this is called A Woman's Satnav After Dark. Turn left. Turn right. Slow pace to let swerving man pass. Turn left. Slight right. Speed up. Put distance between me and man behind me. Cross road. Stare hard at a man waving bottle and shouting at me. Put on noticeable over-ear headphones. No music though, need senses sharp. Turn right. Cross road, avoiding drunk men coming towards me. Continue straight. Walk purposefully, fast and with attitude. Continue straight. This route longer, but busier. Cross road to avoid raucous pub. Speed up. Put distance between me and man behind me. Slight left. Ignore man gesticulating at me as he approaches. Continue straight. Slow down to let man pass me. Turn right. Take longer route to avoid dark road. Continue straight. Street lights broken, find keys to grip. Turn right. Walk in road to avoid overgrown hedges at the side of common. Continue straight. Continue straight. Turn right. Home. Footnote. I started making this mental list of all the things I had done almost unconsciously on a short journey home following a night out. I like a good stomp in the relative quiet of a late evening. Behaviours learned over a lifetime. It was a perfunctory list, not so bad, noticed with a sigh rather than with fear or with anger. A list that pretty much every woman here will be familiar with. Like most of my walks home, but not all, it ended with nothing more than tired feet. It occurred to me that my list might be a good piece of writing, and I just thought no further of it. The next morning I learnt that, and I put a serious sexual assault took place, and then I crossed it out, and an amendment. The next morning I learnt that a woman was raped nearby, an hour or so after my journey, along one of the routes that I would have taken if my satnav hadn't rerouted me. Shaking with anger and sadness, I wrote this not because it could have been me, but that this learned behaviour is a daily part of our lives, and to save our lives. And it's likely to be part of our daughters' lives too. Stop violence against women.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Liz. Very, very powerful. There's a term for that extra labour that women do, and Professor Liz Kelly and Dr. Fiona Gray call it safety work. So additional safety work that women have to do that is almost unconscious, as you say. Our next speaker is Kieran Swan. Artist and producer and facilitator. He is currently the senior program manager here at the Arnolfini. And his work deals with ideas of memorial queerness, performance and bodies as archives, and he is interested in strategies of co-creation and developing meaningful engagement with audiences. Thank you, Kieran.
Thank you. I've been thinking a lot about the In-Between Time Summit, particularly over the past few months as we've prepared to host part of it. And I confess that there's a particular thing as you're preparing to host an event like the summit, where you're so concerned with logistics of your own kind of narrow portion of it. So I confess that I haven't actually been out to see much beyond what's taken place in the building here. But I've been struck by the conversations I've had with Helen and the rest of the team and the collateral around In-Between Time Summit, thinking about the scope of what the summit is kind of attempting to address and to discuss. Thinking about the breadth of concerns from climate change to gender equality to very specific events that happen in Bristol, very specific concerns that are particular to the women and girls of Bristol, to the people of Bristol. And I confess that it's left me feeling somewhat overwhelmed when I think about the capacity of art to address these enormous questions, these enormous problems in the world. And at particularly dark times, doubtful that art can actually do anything about them. The problems of such scale that they threaten the entire world and many of the population of the world. which is, you know, a difficult kind of emotional place to be in when you are working at an organisation whose remit is to present works of visual and contemporary art with a focus on social urgency. And so there's this kind of this struggle to reconcile what our capacity to actually do to change the problems of the world has kind of led me to thinking again about the exhibition that we're currently hosting, Still I Rise, which I hope some of you have been able to experience, and I hope the rest of you will find the time to following. But to give a bit of context, I've worked as a co-curator on Act 3 of Still I Rise, which is a larger project which began last year at Nottingham Contemporary and continued at Delaware Pavilion in Bexhill. And the beginning point for the exhibition was not actually the concept of feminisms, which is now at the forefront. But the beginning point for the research by the curators, Irene, Rosie and Cedric, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, was actually resistance movements. And in their research into resistance movements around the world, focusing on, you know, those and many other particular struggles that I mentioned earlier, they found that feminist practices were at the forefront of them. Feminist modes of thinking, of organising, matriarchal organisations and learning structures were consistent in the most successful resistance movements around the world. And so that's led me to look closely at the work in the exhibition and think about how the struggle to address gender equality, the struggle to address climate change, the struggle to address trans rights and hundreds of other individual concerns that you'll see in the show don't attempt to tackle them all head on. They don't attempt to tackle the enormous problems as a whole, but to deal with specific, local, smaller concerns, and out of all of those individual efforts, weave into a larger tapestry that then start to make headway against these issues. And so I'm thinking then again about art's capacity to act as a roadmap for how we might do this, to model possible strategies of attacking the local, the specific to you, rather than leaning directly into the universal, to the biggest of issues. I'm particularly keen to hear from Phyllis today, who's joining us on this panel, who's one of the artists in the show, whose practice is largely photojournalistic, and who spent time photographing within resistance movements and rallies, particularly in the United States. And that alignment of art and activism and how it can weave together in the most practical way, I think art can give us a strategy towards.
Thank you, Kieran. Thank you, and I think I had time to go around the exhibition before I came in here, and I think it's great that ecofeminism is actually mentioned so many times in the interpretation boards as you go around, which is of course just one example of where schools of feminism have tried to address those, you know, overlapping and intersecting issues. Our next speaker is sitting next to Kieran is Helen Cole, who is actually the founder and artistic director of In Between Time. Helen established the Arnolfini Live programme as one of the most influential live art and contemporary performance programmes in the UK. Her work has included We See Fireworks and Breathe. They've toured across the UK and in fact globally. And her work as well is part of the festival, so you may have already seen it. We Are Warriors is Helen's latest work, made in collaboration with 130 women and girls from Bristol, and that's installed at the Redcliffe Caves throughout the IBT Summit. Thank you, Helen.
Is this working? Yes. Is it? I just thought my voice had gone weird then. So I I was actually hoping to write something specific for this panel, but I did actually run out of time, and I realised I had an hour to do it in just before we were due to come here. So I haven't done that. But what I have done is taken a piece of writing and adapted it. This writing was written about 2 years ago. And I just want to say it's personal, so I hope I'm going to overshare a bit, I'm sorry, on this panel. But and it has got some descriptions of harassment, so I'm just saying that. And of course, if this is a problem, as we've said earlier, please do feel free to leave, and the stewards will ensure you're okay. So my presentation is personal. I hope you don't mind. In my first job in the arts, way back in the late 80s, the deputy director routinely tried to stick his hand up my skirt. He would choose the isolated corridor in which I worked and the moments when everyone else had gone home to assault me. I was 22. I was grateful for this first opportunity in a city I loved. He was in his 50s. He targeted me. For 6 months I tried and sometimes failed to avoid the moments when I might risk being alone with him, until I eventually got together my courage and complained. His all-male senior colleagues knew. They were ineffective, embarrassed and irritated. There were no assurances, just a reluctant acceptance that I had brought it to their attention. In the end, I moved on. Nothing acknowledged, no direct action, no apology. In the same job, a fellow employee stalked me over a period of 2 months, following me home most nights in his car, hassling and propositioning me and waiting outside my flat. He was not a senior member of staff, and his stalking took place after work. In the face of the response I'd come to expect, I did nothing. I toyed with calling the police, but I didn't trust anything would be done. I brazened it out, tried to keep things light, although inside I was livid and terrified. Eventually, I left that job. Then I met him in the same city 20 years later, driving the taxi I innocently got into. I was terrified all over again that he would recognise me and that I had accidentally given him my address. I think about the theatre director who asked me to repeatedly stand in one position on stage under the lights. I was told afterwards that this enabled him and the rest of the all-male cast and crew to see through my shirt. About the countless artistic panels that continue into infinity in which straight white men fill the air with their voices. About the many interviews in which the panels were entirely straight white men. About the jobs missed, the voice lowered to a whisper. I think about why I created IBT as my place of safe mooring, and about the many artists who use their bright minds and strong bodies to confront and confound this privilege and power. I think about the women of the IBT Summit programme, Chittim and Erin, Dorothy, Carmela, about the women who gave their voices and made the lights for We Are Warriors, and so many others. IBT is led and founded by women. You may not have noticed, but 76% of the programme of the IBT Summit is led by women or those who identify as trans or non-binary. I realise this is a deliberate political act, an act of emancipation of community, a different way to be a producer without compromise and survive in the arts. By choosing to work at or with IBT, we have chosen to work outside and against the arts' ruling structures, beyond the mainstream and in some cases hidden from view. All of us are talented, all of us are leaders. We have become street fighters to survive in this world. Only an infinitesimal and tiny number of us have ended up leading major venues, festivals, or producing organisations, but some of us have set up our own to forge new ways of working. We've chosen to create a context of challenge, of care, of truth, of refusal, of community, a place to take a stance and produce our fight from, to never ever repeat this culture of entitlement for any woman who follows. And then you'll see the context within which I wrote it. Go fuck yourself, Weinstein, and all who are like you. Your time is numbered. Just as you objectified, harassed, and talked us down, we are now taking you down. No longer passing as your fucked up fantasy, getting there without you, despite all the barriers you put in our way. Bypassing your version of things, getting somewhere else much more interesting on our own terms, making art as it should be, truthful, real, raucous, ribald, created, produced, directed, performed by women. We will take your gaze full in the face and throw it right back at you. And that's for Blue.
Very much. Thank you, Helen. That's very powerful, and it's good that since the whole Me Too moment, these stories and indeed just women's voices generally get a slightly better reception than what they did before. But I do think it's interesting as I go around working on that area that it is often referred to as a Me Too moment. And of course, I automatically think that's interesting. So if it's a moment, it's a window of opportunity, and it will shut. And then what will happen when it shuts? So I think the legacy building that women are doing, women like yourself are doing in this moment is going to benefit women and girls into the future. So thank you. Our next speaker is Erin Markey, Brooklyn-based performer, musician, writer, and creator of live performance works. Their shows have toured across the US and internationally. And actually, Erin's piece, Singlet, is part of the In Between Time Festival as well, here at the Arnolfini. Thank you.
Right here on this stage.
We're actually sitting on it,
Yeah, very carefully. Okay, so I'm going to be reading off this paper, but in a really conversational way. I'm much better at responding to specific questions about my work than trying to sort of lead with articulating the bullet points of how it deals with gender and resisting the patriarchy. So if you saw Singlet and are curious about process, I would love to speak to those questions, either in the Q&A, in the lobby, at a pub, what have you, or even a cocktail bar. The reason why I feel compelled to make work, live performance in the first place, is so that I don't have to try to spell the thing I'm wrestling with out in ways that use traditional structures of logic and systems of meaning, because those structures and systems are built from what was innovated and normalized through centuries of patriarchal rule. That said, what I make and what I teach is about cultivating and trusting memory, and a kind of memory of feeling, and all the details that come with it, like the weird specificity of it, and trusting that the more specific and honest I am about the thing, whatever that thing is at the time, the better the audience can come along on my ride, the better they can enter my universe, because it's a fleshed out world that doesn't undermine itself by getting scared and relying on narrative structures that are unrelated to that particular universe of that show. Giving the audience permission to make their own sense of the work with their bodies in the space is my gift to them. I'm a kind of a Santa Claus in the theater. Just kidding. Singlet was created as a way to solve a couple of problems. Much of the full-length work I made prior to Singlet used live music to tell the story. Some people would refer to those prior works as musicals, but I always resist that word for really petty reasons. I was commissioned to make a show for the Bushwick Star in Brooklyn, New York, and I was going to make a new musical called Little Surfer, which will be coming out in a couple years. But when we did the math of how long we thought it would take to develop it and how expensive it would be, we realized that we could not raise enough money or finish the show in that amount of time. Normally, I would have bulldozed through those barriers and worked myself into the ground trying to make the impossible possible, which was an awesome byproduct of making other shows. But in this instance, I needed to learn to create a sense of balance, to take care of my own body and the bodies of the other people working on the project. I needed to learn how to respect our labor and our time and our quality of life. And justifying being overworked and underpaid seemed related to the systems that I was resisting. I'm not saying I solved this with Singlet. There's a lot of body slams, and we definitely worked for 13 hours in the theater yesterday. But I did better than I have in prior shows on that level. I'm also really inspired to make work by making them for specific performers, myself being one of them usually, but also other people. In Singlet's case, my good friend Emily Davis, a New York City actress I have worked with quite a lot as a fellow actor with her, but I've never worked with her as a maker. Our love and tensions have always been fraught and easy at the same time, and I had always wanted to make something to showcase both her and the richness of our relationship via our mutual love and devotion to performance and to being conduits of some kind of emotional, energetic frequency that we take as seriously as we do not take seriously. In this case, in Between Time Festival, the artist Mel Crodman is actually playing Emily's part, and maybe this is a different conversation, but it's been fascinating to plug somebody else who I have a totally different rich relationship with into the bones of this other relationship. Not for right now. Anyway, Singlet is a matrix of intimacies and systems of power that are related to being assigned female at birth, to being white, to being middle class, American, a former sex worker, queer, non-binary, etc. This, of course, is the least intentional thing in the show. Of course, I would write that. Those are my circumstances. I have no choice. Nobody ever does when they're making a thing, and anybody who tries to make it seem like their work isn't autobiographical, no matter how different it seems from the facts of their life, is an idiot. I cede my time.
Thank you very much, and thanks for giving us that, rounding off with that critique of the impossibility of objectivity there, which is, of course, a feminist standpoint. So, thank you. The next speaker, next to Erin there, is Chittim Aydemir, who is a Sydney-based artist working in the medium of installations, performance, and video art. Her socially and politically engaged art practice investigates possibilities for intersubjective and transcultural communication with an interest in post-colonial and feminist issues. And through critiquing and decolonising and queering mechanisms, Chittim questions established relations of power and producing work that is driven by research, play, criticism, and humour. Thank you.
Hello, can people hear me? So cool, awesome. I haven't prepared anything, I'm afraid. I just haven't had time. I did the ride performance with 65 participants over 4 days. I ran some creative exchange lab workshops, which was fantastic, and now this. But I do have some thoughts, and yeah, this is going to be good, I'm sure. So I just wanted to start off with this thing. In Australia, we've got this practice of doing an acknowledgement to country. And so before we start an event, we'd say, we're acknowledging the land on which we're standing. And, where I live, it's Gadigal country. And so we'd pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and future. And, in this context, obviously, we're standing on the land of the coloniser, and how do you do that, or how do you think through that? And so I saw this in another speaker's introduction, and I really liked it. I think it's appropriate to acknowledge the lands on which the UK has built its wealth, the lands that were colonised, and the Indigenous peoples whose families were torn apart, and just to acknowledge that fact. I am a queer Muslim artist from Sydney. I've been creating work for about 11 years. How did I come to start with this? It was interesting, actually. There was... I've been making work for many years. I had been making work for more than 11 years, maybe about 15 or so. And I remember going on travels and having this discussion with this person, who was a sociology lecturer, and we're talking about, making work and what that's like, and, I have to say, he was drunk at the time, but like something he said kind of resonated with me. He was like, women, women, they just, you're so afraid, you look at men, they're just idiots. They say stupid things and they just keep doing it, They don't really care. It's like, they can say anything and then they just keep saying it. They just keep moving on. And, we're so reticent when it comes to speaking and making statements. And I resonated with that because, I think part of living in a patriarchal world is that, you live with so much shame, and, everything you say is under the microscope. And I think, it kind of resonated with me in the sense that I thought, I'm just going to throw it out there. Just throw it out there and keep throwing it out there. And I had this policy at the beginning which was about, if I ever get called to something, if I get called to speak or exhibit my work, I'm just not going to say no. And I would have done that at the beginning, I would have just kind of, who doesn't want to be, under their covers watching TV? But and that was really powerful as well, just to throw myself out there. And I think part of living in a patriarchal world is the assumption that you would be quiet and, can place, you don't have a voice, or your voice isn't expected. You're not expected to provide commentary. You're not expected to respond to a situation. And when we do that, we're actually resisting the patriarchy. We're protesting. So, when I was thinking of the question for the provocation for this talk, which was about how does your work resist the patriarchy or inequality, my initial gut reaction was that, well, I don't, I'm not trying to resist the patriarchy, but I feel like just by virtue of speaking, I am. And sometimes by virtue of what I say, it becomes a resistance, a form of resistance. And this is something that I've been stressing with the artists I've been working with in the Creative Exchange Lab, the 4 brilliant artists that I had the pleasure of working with for 2 days. I was trying to get to this point that, the fact that you're a person of colour, you're an artist, you're speaking, you're creating work, you're throwing things out there is huge, is hugely significant. And I applaud that, and, that's something to be really proud of, But yes, we speak, we throw things out there, we respond and we provide commentary, and that's really powerful. So in addition to that, I thought of 2 other things. I was thinking because I was like, I don't resist the patriarch, I don't try to do it. And then, someone sent me the introduction that Finn was going to be reading. I was like, oh yeah, I kind of do actually. So I think it's more of a product of the way I respond to a situation, because I think I like to respond to situations the way I experience patriarchy, which is that it's pernicious, and it infuses everything about the way you live, the way you view your body, the way you interact with people. It just seems to be everywhere. And so I don't try to resist it, but just by virtue of speaking my truth, we do. And I encourage other people to do that as well, to speak their truth and speak back. And yeah, I just was recently reading these brilliant feminists, Rossi Braidotti and also Sarah Ahmed has reflected this as well. They say that, you know, in their writing they provide shelters, or they see their writing as a kind of shelter. And that really resonated with me. You know, when I make art, I see that as a kind of shelter. I'm creating this space for myself. And not only am I creating this space for myself, it's a shelter for other people as well. You know, when we tell stories, I read this somewhere as well, I don't know who said it, but you know, when we create stories, we create places where people might meet. And I really like that idea, that by sharing something, there might be something that someone else can relate to, and by virtue of doing that, we can connect and build momentum in these movements. So creating shelters, creating places where people might meet, I feel like that's something that we can strive towards, just keeping on telling our stories and speaking back. Thanks.
A quote about, oh, there we go. It reminds me of a quote, something to do with it's always better to take a place at the table, otherwise you'll end up on it being eaten. Thank you, Chittim. So our next speaker and last speaker on the panel, but not least, is Phyllis Christopher. Phyllis Christopher's work has documented LGBT visibility and protest in San Francisco, and that's been widely published. She's currently working as a photojournalist and facilitates workshops in the north of England. Her work is also exhibited here as part of the Still I Rise festival. And that highlights the experiences of women and celebrates their triumphs and shows how the struggle for liberation is ongoing and hard won. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I've been having a lot of thoughts, and they're not going to come out logically. But mostly over the past couple weeks, when I've been thinking about coming here, I've been thinking about, and I went to the climate emergency event earlier today, and you just start thinking about how do you keep going and how do you justify doing art. And I came across a quote, and it says, "In hard times, beauty can seem frivolous, but take it away and all you're left with is hard times." That's by Paul Madonna, and he's a graphic novelist from San Francisco. So I'm a photographer. My work started, the work that's in this show is very early work from the late 80s, early 90s. It was all street photography of ACT UP, Queer Nation. It was the AIDS crisis was happening, and it just seemed like every week you would just be out in the street photographing, because it was, you know, constant demonstrations. But what grew out of that work, and what was very important, was lesbians were really coming of age, and the work that I took through that and through the 90s and early 2000s was like very sexual lesbian imagery. And I think it's really important to value sexuality and pleasure and try to maintain a sense of humor, because that's when you're winning. You know, if you're I always say the party is the victory, because we all came from small towns. Like, you know, I came from Buffalo, New York, just to survive. And in those days, you just had to get out of your small town and go to New York or go to San Francisco. And the gay community came together, and in the darkest of times, we mourned, but we had a party and we documented it. And now what's really cool is I have this catalog of images that I'm pretty sure is going to get published as a book. So I'm very excited about that. Yeah, it's going to be called Heart Hand Art, because that's how it was a community effort. It was definitely a collaboration. I was, I'm part of the lesbian community. I was photographing my friends and models. I worked for a magazine called On Our Backs, which was the first all lesbian-run sex magazine. So when you look back at these photographs, you kind of think now, with all these problems in the world, like, why is it important to look at sex? Doesn't it seem frivolous? But it isn't. It's, you know what, when they take away your joy, that's when they're winning. So you've just got to keep going back to, where's your pleasure? I wanted to read another quote from the intro to my book that sort of describes the work and the era. And also the concept that it's much more difficult to bring pleasure to another human being than it is to be mean or to bring pain. And it's also, I think it's a very patriarchal idea, to undervalue pleasure and glorify, violence, obviously. So, San Francisco is a city that attracts people who are committed to exploring pleasure. It always surprises me that in a world of so many horrors, anybody could find fault with images of pleasure. It felt like the city understood the need for stories of ourselves to be made. There was an almost desperate energy to make them. To pose for a sexual photograph was a political act that required courage. It was still possible to lose a job in many professions for being a lesbian. Many of us felt we had lost so much, and this fed into our extreme rethinking of relationships and lifestyles. There was a freedom in a subculture of women who have been disowned by their families and shut out of mainstream culture. And that also reminds me of, when you talk about working in a patriarchal system, I swear to God, we worked in such a lovely bubble of the LGBT community, and just like the lesbian community, like making magazines, books, movies for years, until it became too expensive to live in San Francisco. So I guess that's what I've been thinking today. And I would just encourage any people, I was going to say especially young people, but like old people, whatever your story is, to document it, because someday it'll be really valuable. I guess and I'm, obviously I'm more comfortable in conversation, so if you've got questions, that would be good.